Thank you so much for that opening. And yes, I'm one of those unruly students who give their professors very much gray hair because I can't keep to one topic. I'm supposed to be a computational neuroscientist, but I started doing virtual reality and a little bit of Latin. And shouldn't medical engineering, isn't that fun? And eventually, of course, people like me end up in the philosophy department because that's the only place to put us. And my job at the Future Humanity Institute deals with thinking very big, very long term about the future and the fate of the world and our chances. So this is a topic that is quite close and close to my heart. And so hopefully today we're going to delve into interesting questions of doom and gloom and maybe also a fair dollop of hope. But of course, one way of opening any talk is to start by critiquing its title. There is this wonderful rule that if a title of a paper or a news story has a question, the answer is usually no. No, it doesn't look like climate change is likely to do us in. It's not the end of the world. But another main point I want to get across is, of course, it makes things a lot worse. And there are other risks that are competing with climate change and interacting with climate change that we need to deal with, and most of them are human-caused. And I do think we can do something about them. Now, when thinking about a topic like this, I'm reminded of a dinner conversation I had with a friend some months ago. And she was asking me, so Anders, you research the end of the world. What do you think about the imminent collapse of society? That's interesting. I said, I haven't got the memo. When is it supposed to happen and why? And she started explaining various factors that made her think that everything is going downhill and soon it's going to come crashing down. And yeah, kids not listening to the wisdom of their elders, yeah. And people following populist politicians, leading them into devastatingly bad decisions, yeah. And so on. And I was thinking, that's nothing new. We have been doing this for thousands of years. Why does this lead to a collapse right now? And then it dawned on me gradually in the conversation when she got a bit annoyed at me for not getting her point, but what she actually expressed was concern. She was talking about the big important things that concerned her and should concern us about how do we fix society? What are the driving factors that make things not work as they should, and what do we do about it? And it might even be that we want to just commiserate about some of these big ones that we cannot deal with. But it's important to recognize that they are bad things and so on. But in my daily work, I quite often deal with the end of the world as a quite literal thing. How much energy does it take to blow up the planet? How quickly could a microorganism spread everywhere to kill everyone? And what can we do to detect that one before that happens and prevent it from happening? That's a very concrete thing. It's not at all about showing concern. It's more about a technical question and maybe figuring out, and then who do we call at the United Nations to try to get them to do something about it? That is a profound question. I might not have an answer, and after that I might then be commiserating at the pub. But yeah, so this talk will be about the actual end of the world, but I do think it's interesting to think back quite often when we're talking about climate, about how we use this to frame our concerns about what's wrong in the world in general. But if I'm claiming that climate change can't cause the end of the world, what do I say about this, planet Venus? This is, after all, what climate change really can mess up. So in the case of Venus, what happened there probably was it overheated a bit. So it's not just carbon dioxide that's a greenhouse gas. Water vapor is also pretty good at trapping heat. So if your planet gets a bit warm, you get evaporations from the ocean. The atmosphere gets better at trapping heat. It gets warmer. More water evaporates. Soon you have a really hot atmosphere, and then you have boiling oceans, and now you have a steam atmosphere that's excellent at capturing heat. And then it just gets hotter and hotter up until a point where even some of the limestone and carbonate rocks start boiling off a bit of extra carbon dioxide. And then you end up with the Earth's sister planet Venus, which has a balmy temperature right now of about 475 Celsius. That's enough to melt lead. It's not a pleasant place. And we could envision that what if we released enough greenhouse gases? Could we cause this on Earth? And you can try to solve this mathematically, and it gets very hairy rather quickly. There are models that suggest that that can't happen. A better approach, quite often when you're a futurist, you always want to go to history, is that you try to look at old data. What happened historically, and in particular here, we might look at the temperature of Earth across time. So this diagram is awesome and also kind of hard to interpret. Each of these little boxes has its own scale. So the one furthest to the right corresponds to the vastest scale. That is kind of the average temperature we have estimated over spans of tens of millions of years, from the Cambrian era, when it was pretty hot, and then it cooled off a bit during Ordovician, and then you got a real peak in the Devonian era, and then it cooled down during the Carboniferous to a real serious ice age, and then it got warm again, and so on. In the green one, which I'm going to come back to, we see a kind of zoomed out thing. That's just after the dinosaurs have left the stage, and the mammals and birds are kind of fighting it out about who's going to run the planet for the next tens of millions of years. We are kind of in the box furthest to the right, I mean. Oh, left and right are hard things here. So that blue curve, so this is based on temperature measurements, while the other blue box, the one with the little spikes, that correspond to ice cores. And what you can see here, those low temperatures, we're right in the middle of an ice age, right at this moment. What has happened is basically that the ice age has a brief interruption, an interglacial. And modern humanity developed very much during this particular interglacial that you see zoomed out to the right. And it's been nice, warm, and surprisingly stable for almost 10,000 years. There is just this ominous little spike at the end, which is, of course, our anthropogenic climate change. But what we can see in this diagram is that even when it's getting hotter, it's still nothing compared to how it was earlier. So now I want to look at that peak of the curve, that green peak. Some of you, probably not even all, can see that there is even a little spike above it. And that is the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. So over a span of about 100,000 years, the planet became about 8 degrees warmer than the already warm state it previously had. At this point, there was literally crocodiles and palm trees up in the Arctic. And there is some evidence that there was heat stress on a lot of organisms in the ocean. But life survived. Earth didn't overheat. This is kind of a demonstration that even a very severe deviation actually doesn't easily crash the climate system. Even that very warm, very moist world eventually cooled down. Indeed, it cooled down because one species turned out to wreck the climate. Not us humans, this was 50 million years ago, but a small fern called Azolla. It looks a bit like duckweed. It's still around. It loves floating on water, and then it grows. And in warm sunlight, like you could get up in a tropical Arctic, it grows really, really well. So what happened was basically that the Arctic Ocean got covered with Azolla, and when the Azolla sank down to the bottom, it turned into carbon. There is actually quite a lot of coal up in the Arctic because of Azolla. Over a span of a few 100,000 years to a few million years, Azolla drained half of the carbon dioxide from Earth's atmosphere. That species did kind of reverse what we're doing. It was enough to actually stop this heating and then lead to a slow process that eventually led to the current ice age, which we can't blame the fern for because we probably should be blaming the Panama Isthmus and the Himalayas for that. Basically, they're adding the geological forces that make Earth rather cold right now. And then occasionally, the Earth's axis aligns in the right way, and we get a brief interglacial when you can actually live in Europe and it's not covered with ice. But don't worry, the ice is going to eventually come back in some tens of thousands of years. As a Scandinavian, I'm not exactly looking forward to that. Now, the interesting thing here is that we can see that we didn't get the end of the world because of that kind of extreme heat peak, which we still don't know why it happened. It might be volcanic eruptions, it might be a breakdown of methane trapped under the ocean that bubbled up or something else. So it's still worth investigating that quite a bit. But when we look at the current state of climate models and so on, it seems like, okay, is everything fine and we can just go home? And the answer is, of course, not quite. It's interesting to see that the climate models have gotten better and better. When I grew up, my dad, who was about as relentlessly pessimistic as I'm optimistic, told me that he read some of the news stories about climate research suggesting that an ice age was on its way. In the 70s, that was actually the dominant theory, and there was some evidence for it, then it turned out to actually not hold up. But he was conscientious. He also pointed out there are dissidents saying that anthropogenic climate change is going to heat things up. So either we're going to get an ice sheet above our house, or we're going to be flooded. Yeah, my dad was a very gloomy man. Now, the interesting thing is, as the climate models have gotten better and better, we actually have a decent understanding of where we might go. The problem is, of course, it's very dependent on how much carbon dioxide we release. So the IPCC have done a lot of modeling based on different scenarios on how much the economy grows and how much you add of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So you get these different curves. And this is, of course, what we see all the time on the television set, people arguing about whether we can reach the Paris Agreement, etc.